Welcome everyone to today's webinar, The Next Planning Paradigm, the Evolution of IBP in the Face of AI. Today's session is being presented by George Fowler and John Sharkey. Gentlemen, thanks for carving out some time to chat. Tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and why we should listen to what you have to say.
Thanks, Jamie, and hello, everyone. My name is George Fowler, and I'm the Chief Technology Officer and Head of Supply Chain Planning here at Spinnaker SCA. I've been in the industry a little over 30 years, and I've spent the last 18 years building what we think is a world-class organization here for supply chain delivery at Spinnaker. And with me, we have our CEO, John. John.
Hey, folks. So John Sharkey, I'm the CEO of Spinnaker SCA and the Global Supply Chain Practice Lead for Publicis Sapient, which acquired Spinnaker in 2024. So quick background on Spinnaker. We're a global supply chain management consultancy, which means we work with retailers, distributors, manufacturers to develop, industry-leading supply chain capabilities, focusing on people, process, technology, pretty much a holistic view of supply chain. Our expertise within supply chain spans strategy, planning, and supply chain execution. And so today we're here to talk about supply chain planning, which is an area where George and I both have kind of grown up and specialized. And it's an area that's evolving, really faster than it has at any time in either of our careers.
Yeah, that's true. Everything is really moving along, John. As you can tell, both John and I have been in the industry for decades. You can tell from the gray hair. Well, I think supply chain has reached really a new and exciting era, especially using the power of AI. I can't help but think back to the original days of when we were helping companies to do S&OP, really when it would take months and months to pull together all the data that was necessary to make decisions. There's this running joke in the industry that companies would spend 6 to 8 weeks doing a monthly cycle. And, at this point in time, I think while the complexity of the problems have not changed, the ability to achieve and dynamically cleanse data, get to answers and resolve them very quickly has really emerged as a leading capability with the AI revolution. I think some of the things that we've seen in the past are now we're capable of doing today. John, you've been in the industry a while as well. What are some of your earliest memories of S&OP in the early days?
Sure. So I'll kind of flash back to, kind of the early 2000s, a fast-growing consumer electronics company that we were working with. And we'd been hired to sort of build planning processes and implement systems to help them scale. They went from a few $100 million to Fortune 500, in the period of 3 to 4 years. And we kind of started working with them early in that journey. But as we were looking at supply chain planning systems, we had, defined an S&OP process, and they decided to try to implement that process really ahead of having, strong technology capabilities. And it was the right thing to do. But if you think about what it took to run that process without systemic support, they gathered demand plans from the sales teams, they pulled inventory from their ERP, they, got production plans from the manufacturing teams, and they tried to mash all of that together, just looking at finished goods, kind of balanced demand versus supply. And then they would take that into an executive meeting and they would literally comb through charts and they would say, oh, this one looks out of control. We're producing a lot more than what we're selling, or we're selling a lot more than, what we think we have the capability to produce. And they would just go assign action items and people would go off and work on them. The whole process took more than 4 weeks to gather all that data. It was clearly outdated by the time they started the discussions around it. And then kind of the feedback loop, around making changes, it took another 4 weeks to basically see any kind of impact. So it was a slow moving and kind of high latency process, I would say. If you look at, S&OP in general, integrated business planning is kind of the evolution, I would say, of S&OP, having added, more scenario analysis, more financials, a more holistic view of kind of the end-to-end product roadmap. The basic steps of what we're trying to do really hasn't changed all that long. We go through kind of the product plan, the demand plan, the supply plan, and then really the integrated business plan that you see today. This hasn't changed that much in probably the last 15 to 20 years, I would say. But in reality, the cadence is still pretty slow for a lot of companies, and they still have a very hard time running a bunch of scenarios, especially scenarios that kind of span these different business processes.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, John, that much of the processes that we work through haven't changed. I guess what's probably more distressing for companies today as we fast forward and look at how companies are working in the industry today is the fact that they're still struggling with the same business challenges, but they're also struggling to keep up with, with the demands that are in front of them. Maybe it's time we share a little bit about, what we're doing to kind of accelerate and help them adapt AI as an accelerating agent for achieving these processes much faster.
So if we think about kind of the evolution of connected planning and what's changed, and sort of how do we think about overall S&OP, just to give a little bit of history, and then we'll kind of jump into some of the stuff that we're building today. In the early days, you had S&OP as a business process is almost as old as I am, and George was picking on my gray hair and my bad beard earlier. But if you kind of think about that, starting in the 80s, it was very manual, is what I talked about before. That evolved to collaborative planning and forecasting and replenishment. So CPFR kind of coming along with P&G and Walmart in the 90s. These are we've known for a long time that kind of connected business decision making between functions, between supply chain partners is a good idea. If you kind of hit the next step, in the 90s and the early 2000s, you had collaborative planning tools, so advanced planning tools for demand planning, supply planning, S&OP, CPFR kind of come along and provide that systemic support so that you could do it, faster and more effective. Although, with some of the problems I talked about earlier around, doing scenarios and pulling data from a bunch of different sources. If you look at kind of what's really changed in the last, maybe 5 to 10 years, there's probably two big changes that I would point at. There's, integrated data platforms. So previously we used to, spend a lot of time thinking about, oh, there's demand data over in this cube, and there's, POS data from our retail channel over in this cube, and pulling all of that together was a massive, it was just not feasible the way that technology, worked, before, I don't know, 5 to 10 years ago, really at scale. And then on top of that, you have AI-driven analytics and scenario modeling. So, machine learning has obviously been around a long time, but, matured as a decision support for capability for supply chain, probably in the last 10 years, I would say. And then we'll show something on the Gen AI side where there's really, huge possibilities to sort of use solutions like generative AI to enable autonomous decision-making across, processes and systems.
It's definitely an exciting time for supply chain practitioners, especially as it pertains to many of the traditional activities that they used to perform over the years. I mean, leveraging a combination of trend analysis, real-time updates, and an agentic platform now gives them the ability to bridge the gap between planning expectations and operational outcomes, significantly reducing the amount of firefighting that these companies are doing, creating recommendations that are feasible and cost effective at the same time, and also align with their corporate goals and objectives, which wasn't always happening along the way. I think my favorite part of these solutions is really the fact that these systems are actively looking at historic data and real-time data today to correct themselves. So the self-healing nature of these solutions today can be used to take data that was often deleted in the past and use that as a mechanism for improving future results and seeing trends that people weren't necessarily seeing as they were doing their normal firefighting activities. So what are the things that, John, you see in terms of IBP and how the role that AI will be playing in the next paradigm of applications that are out there?
So I still think there's a lot of focus that needs to be put on the business processes. The different steps that I laid out earlier, I think those continue to exist. I think there's still executive reviews to kind of look at key decisions. But with more data available and AI agents to help evaluate and make decisions, the actual speed of decision making can accelerate. So we can make decisions as frequently as it's useful to make the decisions, as opposed to just being kind of stuck in this somewhat slow moving monthly process. So with all of those tools and capabilities, the time that it takes to grind through the data and the huge amount of time that planners spend even today, kind of digging through the data, root causing the problems, and sort of trying to get to the point of saying, what should I actually do about that problem, should be reduced. AI is really powerful at kind of going through that type of analysis, and I think that's the kind of demo that we wanted to put in front of you guys now. So if we look at this quick scenario, it's a company, they did an annual plan in October, and this is a planner coming along in December and saying, how does our 2026 plan look relative to that operating plan? So the system comes back and it can describe, production and capacity, revenue, inventory, a bunch of different areas. And then it kind of summarizes at the bottom, though, that there's a shortfall in sales in the Americas for a couple $100 million and over it in international. So the planner goes in and wants to see some information on what's going on in the Americas, get some summary information of both sales and inventory. Same type of charts on the international side, where you see kind of cumulatively there's a revenue increase. Natural kind of next step is what are the root causes? What's behind this? So the LLM, the Gen AI tool, with all of this great supply chain data behind it, can basically find two factors on the sales side. One, sedan that's underselling due to a demand issue, and then an SUV that has a supply constraint. Looking at strategies to go address those issues, there's pricing incentives, media spend, precision advertising, things that's part of Sapient and as part of Publicis we think about. And if you think about it, the system can basically identify those types of strategies for you. In this case, the example is kicking off an agent over in a different part of the business to go look at pricing changes or promotional changes and that sort of thing. And then essentially orchestrating a cross-functional business scenario. So that sort of flew by, but it's a pretty, kind of an example of the power today to use, interfaces like a chat interface, which we just showed. The same solution, we could basically spit out, summaries of what's going on in my business. So instead of the planner showing up in the morning and saying, I'm going to spend a couple hours digging through reports and looking at exceptions, let's, kind of prioritize and give them the big picture, and then, just give them essentially, picture a 5-paragraph email in your inbox, kind of saying what happened last night, or how is the plan evolved in the last week. They could do that, and then also being able to look at the same type of information in a reporting environment. So a bunch of different ways to engage with people and then coordinate these cross-functional scenarios.
Yeah, John, we've always known that connected decision making was a good idea, and I love the way that you've weaved in both the traditional supply chain, but some of the work that we do here at Publicis Sapient, where we're taking some of that connected external data, market sentiment, and so on, and being able to use that as part of the sensing that is done behind the scenes to help inform the models. One of the questions that I get asked pretty often is, well, in order to get to this point, what do I have to do to the systems that I have? What about the investments that I've made in the supply chain tools that I have in place? And can I move forward and accomplish many of the things that you're talking about with AI while at the same time driving the car down the road that's still moving? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think the way that these solutions are architected really kind of, you should think about them as supplementing solutions that you have today. So if you look at kind of this graphic, on the bottom we have enterprise solutions. There's still going to be, obviously naturally there's still ERP, there's supply chain planning systems or WMS or TMS, the same type of opportunities exist. CRM systems, merchandising systems, external data, sales plans, et cetera, et cetera. Those enterprise systems still exist, but what these agents are very good at doing is sort of, filling in the white space and helping kind of coordinate across. So in the scenario that we demoed earlier, it would be, the core information that was being looked at was coming out of the supply chain planning systems, looking at forecasts and inventory and supply projections, that sort of thing. But if you think about, running a scenario on pricing or promotional changes, there's algorithms and there's tools that exist over in the merchandising and sales planning portion of the business that look at exactly those type of problems. And what the agents and kind of these architectures are good at doing is sort of pulling up all that information, giving you visibility to the big picture, and then coordinating something that would say, okay, let's go run a pricing scenario that might, juice my demand, right? And so I can bring that back in, run a new demand planning scenario in my legacy solution that would be taking that input on a pricing or a promotional change, feed that through my supply chain planning engine, the same engine that I have today, and then basically sort of look at that in more of a scenario environment without being totally beholden on, sort of, I would say, harder architectural changes between those systems. So it's a what you're doing today and these type of solutions for the most part.
All right. Well, one of the other questions that I get asked often is really how realistic is the autonomous capabilities of these agents? How realistic from a decision-making perspective, especially in supply chain, is it to have an agent out there working independently on behalf of an end user to make these types of decisions? What are the steps on that journey, and how far away are we from that reality? I have to pretend like I don't know the answer to this, but John, what do you have to say about that question?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things I would say is that for most of my career, a lot, we kind of talked about a bunch of this stuff really hasn't changed, but the hard work to make supply chain planning work more effectively is thinking about data and change management and business policies. The systems have generally not been sort of the blocker. But if we kind of look at, there's a Gartner framework we like to refer to from, it's a pretty classic kind of famous framework, from 2012, where they talk about descriptive analytics, which is, things like reporting, diagnostic analytics, like why is something happening? You sort of flip into predictive, which is forecasting, machine learning, that sort of thing. What do we think is going to happen next? And then what should we do? The optimization engines, the prescriptive side of things. These capabilities have been around, for my kind of entire career. And the big change, if we kind of go back to the data and the AI side of things, is that we sort of supplement these capabilities that we've had in the past. And I'm usually, I would say, not a sort of rah super pro, like technology is going to change the world type of person, to be honest. But I do think that kind of with the layer of kind of the analytics, and maybe hit the next click if we could, kind of the analytics that underlie these things, and then generative AI is sort of a coordinating capability across the top. There's going to be huge potential, but it builds on what we've been doing today. So we'll use the analytics like ML and prescriptive optimization, but the technological advances in generative AI kind of give us a framework for doing what's next, which I do think getting to autonomous decision making is pretty probable for many problems. And the other comment I would make here is that with predictive and prescriptive analytics, there's a ton that's being done today in leading companies where people manage the inputs and the rules in the system, and they never touch the output. The optimization engine makes decisions on what's going to get produced, and with a little bit of oversight, we act on those decisions. And I think autonomous is just sort of, one more step along that journey, as well as, allowing to look at things cross-functionally. So, clearly there's like worry about agents getting out of controls and things like that. But and we should worry about that. But earlier this week, I saw there was like an MIT Georgia Tech study where they looked at agents, and they had guardrails on agents, but they looked at them, playing the beer game and managing the bullwhip effect. And they were doing a better job kind of, managing those big swings that you see if you play the beer game, than humans were doing. And what was really interesting was when they looked at Gen AI solutions from 6 months ago, those Gen AI solutions weren't as good at sort of following these rules and figuring things out in a rational way. And so, I do think that, it'll never be 100% lights out probably, and people need to make the big strategic decisions. But a lot of kind of the day-to-day run the business type of decisions, I think we can automate, to a pretty high degree.
Thank you for that answer, John. Kind of moving ahead to the next slide, one of the things that we get asked a lot is, one, getting beyond the hype of AI. How do clients like ours actually engage and do this? And the good news is this is real. This is happening now. And there are things that we can do and work with you right away to help enable your progress towards an AI-based autonomous supply chain. The first thing that you need to know is that there's work to be done behind the scenes, making your data accessible, cloud accessible in many cases. And this is a combination of both your historic data and the real-time data that's available in your solutions today. The really cool part about this is we are leveraging data that in many cases, as I mentioned before, is omitted. Your exceptions are so informative to the processes and the root causes of some of the activities that are going on today. We capture a lot of that in our supply chain data platform to be able to reuse and help your solution self-heal. The other things that you can do is make sure that your applications are up to date. They're composable in systems and applications that are easily accessible to make that data accessible. So one of the things that you'll see is modern code. We're working with companies today to help modernize their code, bring them up to modern standards so that data can be accessible both on the real time or over a period of time to see trend analysis. We actually have a methodology here that we call our slingshot methodology that helps to enable companies to make that leap moving forward. The other thing is, and really getting back to one of the comments that you made earlier, John, is really aligning with target operating models and KPIs. It is absolutely imperative that companies understand what their North Stars are, understanding what the business is expected to do, what your operational differentiators are. Because once you start training these models, you want to make sure that they are set up to achieve the outcomes that are best for your company. And so making sure that the metrics that you're measuring and the outcomes that you're training these models on are aligned is imperative as you move forward. And then having a change-ready mindset. One of the things that this is going to do is as your AI agents become more autonomous, as they do more of the mundane firefighting that you would see your planners do on a regular basis, you now need to use your valuable knowledge to educate and uplift the people in your organization so they can better use the information that's available to them while actually doing high value activities that are associated with coming up with new opportunities for the business to thrive. All right. So with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Jamie.
Yeah, so at this time, we're going to open it up for questions. That was a ton to cover, obviously, in the 30 minutes we've got with you guys. I know we're just getting started and just scraping the top of the topic here. We did have a question come in from the audience that I think is probably on everyone's minds. How have you guys actually seen AI actually working for clients? Where are they getting traction? Any specific use cases that you're seeing success with?
Yeah, I could sort of take the history of the solution that we showed earlier, which was really rooted in the idea of doing plan versus plan scenario analysis, or a plan. You could take a plan and compare it with what actually happened and sort of quickly diagnose those things. So this actually grew out of some work that we do in what I would call sort of a fairly slow clock speed service area for us, which is doing network design projects. And if you think about a network design project, which is I should think about how product flows through my overall supply chain network. Should I think about building a new DC or expanding capacity, that sort of thing. And so you look at all these really, we typically might run 60 or 70 scenarios, right? If we do that type of project. We would work with clients to compare those scenarios. And, back in the day, it was a very manual, labor-intensive effort to do that. And so that team has been, working for many, many years on sort of how do we automate comparing scenarios and getting to like the meaningful differences between those scenarios. A story I've been talking about recently is like little over a year ago, we had a client who came to us and said, "Oh, you did this network optimization study for us. Here it is a year later. You said my freight would be $20 million lower. And I look at my freight today and it's the same. And a year ago we said, oh, Mr. Client, we want you to understand what happened. We want to understand what happened. And we put an analyst on the issue, and they spent several weeks gathering all this data, doing the analysis. And it kind of came back to, well, the demand had changed, the mix had changed, and the cost of fuel had changed. So that $20 million, he didn't see a reduction of $20 million in his freight spend, but he would have seen an increase of, let's say $20 million or something in that area if they hadn't made this change to their network. But it was weeks and weeks of work. And it was, basically what we were doing was taking a scenario and comparing it with the actuals. So on those type of projects, we basically took these tools that we've been building for scenario comparisons and then said, well, rather than having a person grind through all that analysis, let's start to use Gen AI on top of it. And that's been sort of the evolution. So, slower projects, but now we're in the process of working with clients, to look at monthly S&OP plans or daily supply plans and essentially really apply the same type of logic, be able to look at, kind of how is my plan evolving over time? And then, how do we quickly evaluate, what's happening today or compare different scenarios as part of S&OP. And to do that, they've basically had to, think about a couple of different things that I'll leave you guys with as we get to the end of our half an hour. One is, what are the 3 decisions that you sort of, make you have to rethink the decisions you're making as you're running your business and say, how quickly do I want to make those decisions, and at what level, what speed is it useful? And so really rethinking, decision making and business processes and how we make those decisions is kind of step 1. Step 2 is, I think there's a lot of benefit to starting to really build up a memory of what's going on in your supply chain. In many companies, we keep, last month's snapshot or maybe a snapshot from the beginning of the year, but these tools really thrive on the ability to take all these different scenarios and sort of build up on what's evolving. And so there's a benefit on starting to save this data. And I'm thinking about it from a planning perspective, but it applies in a bunch of different areas so that you can get the benefit of what the tools can glean on, how decisions get made in your business and sort of how results unfold relative to those. And then, I think the last one is just thinking about it from an end-to-end solution architecture perspective. So, how do the tools that I have today fit into it? How do I nobody just sort of goes pure greenfield and, starts from scratch with these things, but it's, how do I think about the capabilities in this area and the way to sort of layer them in to make better decisions in my business?
Well, thank you, John and George. You did that in 30 minutes. Clearly, the conversation is just getting started. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, though. If you guys want to continue the AI use case discussion, please feel free to reach out to the team and we'll get you scheduled with our experts. Tomorrow, please check your email for a link to the video replay and slides. We'll also have a link to schedule a consultation if you'd like to talk more. as we know, as you guys are living it, the world of supply chain is evolving fast. Please follow us on LinkedIn. We'll be posting supply chain insights weekly. You can stay up to date with our thought leadership there. But thank you all for carving out 30 minutes of their time to speak with us today on this very important topic. Look forward to seeing you guys out there on LinkedIn. Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you, John and George. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, folks.
Have a great
Thank you,
holiday.
everyone.
Happy New Year, everyone.
Happy holidays.